This is your Chapter 4 review for the vocabulary art. Make sure that you understand each one of these terms that are all about the visual elements: line, shape, mass, light, color, value, texture, and space. And then in the 20th century, two more things were added: time and motion. So we'll use works of art to help define each one of these terms. We can start off by looking at something by Elizabeth Murray that uses all of these components in the work of art. Every artist uses these visual elements in their work as tools for creating their ideas. So any one of these terms can be used to discuss a work of art. Line as a term is a path traced by a moving point. Make sure you understand the difference between an outline, something that keeps shapes very two-dimensional, this is Keith Haring, versus something that shows the contour lines. If you think about each one of these images of the bull, if you just go around the outside edges, you wouldn't be able to see the placement of the head or the legs as the bull is moving. So contour lines start to show a little bit more of the three-dimensional boundaries of forms. Make sure you understand the difference. Lines are important for direction and movement in a work of art. So any time that you see a line created by an object, that line helps describe and define movement in the work of art. Our eyes follow the railings in this image. Our eyes follow the line of bodies, and each line in the image helps divide the space between background and foreground in the photograph. We can also see this in Eakin's paintings. So you see the horizontal line of the boat, the horizontal line of the shore, diagonal lines of the clouds. Each one has a different feeling to it. So horizontal lines in a work of art tend to feel stable, or they tend to make things feel like they are at rest, whereas something that is diagonal feels energetic, and a lot of times something vertical feels very assertive. And so if you overlay from the text the lines that are in the work of art, you can see how they are working in this painting. Implied lines are very important for the way an artist can tell a story in the composition. So this is a really important work by Géricault. He was an artist who came after the Renaissance, so he knew all of the techniques for making human beings look three-dimensional, making them look very naturalistic, and he's using lines to tell this story of something that actually happened, which is what was so important. A lot of times artists had been doing works that were historical, but from a great distance in the past, or something that was often religious and something from the Bible. This was an event that had just taken place, and Géricault even went to hospitals to look at bodies in the morgue. He interviewed the survivors of this event, where 150 people go out on this boat, they're shipwrecked, and all of a sudden you have the crew save themselves, and they leave a bunch of passengers to fend for their survival. So in this work, you can see the lines, this strong diagonal of bodies carrying us off, looking in the distance where they see hope and salvation. There's something there that's going to save them. But then these lines in the sail show us how their torture isn't over yet, because the wind is going to carry them off in another direction. So look for implied lines in a work that help us tell the story. This is another one also using implied lines to tell a different kind of story. So you have here Watteau. He was from the Rococo era, and he was telling about French aristocracy in this painting. So they've been off to have this lovely fête galante, a kind of outdoor party, and they're here on this island where they can gather and have fun, and they're getting ready to head back to reality. You can even see the color shift between this fairy tale kind of island side of the painting, and then the line carries us down and across and off to the boat where they're getting ready to go back to sail, almost like sailing back to reality on this side of the painting. So look for implied lines and how they tell the story in a work of art. Understand the difference between geometric shapes and organic shapes. So organic shapes, think about things that speak of nature, and geometric shapes, think about volumes in geometry, squares, circles, diamonds, those sorts of things. And shape can be something that is two-dimensional. You can see that in this work of art by Whitehorse. So she's pulling lots of shapes from her history as a Native American. And shape can be defined by actual lines. They can also be defined by a change in value, dark and light, or a change in color, the red and the blue. So there are identifiable boundaries that make up each one of the shapes, but it's still two-dimensional. Whereas this mass is 3D. So this sculpture is actually over 6 feet in height. You're looking at something that is also Pacific Northwest Native American, and it tells of an origin tale. So this bird that you're looking at has actual mass. He's probably about 3 feet in height as part of this sculpture that you're looking at. You can also have shapes implied within a composition. So when you see Mary and Jesus and John the Baptist, you are looking at something that forms a kind of triangle in the work of art because of where he's placed the figures, where he's placed the head and the foot of Mary. It gives something very stable in the composition, very, very harmonious. This is something from the Renaissance by Raphael. So understand these terms as well. Figure is something that we can detach and focus on. It doesn't have to be a human figure. It's an object in the work of art that we can focus on. Whereas the ground is going to be the background or surrounding information. Positive shapes kind of relate to the word figure. They are the shapes that we perceive. And then negative shapes, the negative space is just as important. So if you look at this, you can see these positive shapes, but this negative space inside that's implied is just as important. There are many ways to create value in a work of art. Hatching and cross-hatching are techniques that artists use using lines, single lines for hatching, doubling the lines for cross-hatching. And when you use that network of lines, all of a sudden on this two-dimensional surface, you start to have a head that looks three-dimensional. And that's what chiaroscuro is all about. It's using light and shadow to give mass to objects on a two-dimensional surface. So Leonardo da Vinci has done this study as a preparation for a painting, and you can see the way he has used charcoal. He has used areas with hatching. He has used some light areas, not so much with cross hatching because he begins to smudge and smear the charcoal, but he is creating something that has volume, and that is important for making these figures look three-dimensional on a two-dimensional surface. So make sure you understand that term chiaroscuro. And light, or the use of light and value, helps to model form. This is not modeling like a model walking down a runway. This is the way that we use light to make something look three-dimensional. So here you have it in a photograph. Here you had modeling on these figures where Da Vinci used light and shadow. Just look at the arm of the infant. The light shows the curves of the shoulder. The shadow shows the neck that is sitting behind his arm. That is what is making the figure look three-dimensional. Understand the basic components of color, that it is a function of light. Isaac Newton was a key figure in the history of understanding how color works. And there's two kinds of things to think about in terms of color. Additive mixing is when you combine light. So you end up combining the red, green, and blue. And with light, you will arrive at white, like sunlight. Whereas with subtractive color mixing, that's what we do with paint. So when you add red, yellow, and blue and other colors, the more colors that you add with paint, the more you head towards black. It's the opposite. Please understand the components of the color wheel, the primary colors, secondary colors, and tertiary colors. Make sure you understand what they mean. Someone who had a scientific approach to color was Georges Seurat. So what he did was use dots of pure color that we would optically mix as we're looking at the work of art. So instead of pre-mixing the colors for the clouds in the sky or the land that's here in the foreground, he put dots of color that we view, and as we perceive them, they start to work together as a massive land or a massive sky. This was called pointillism, and it was one of the groundbreaking events in art history in terms of a scientific development to the use of color. This is a contemporary artist using something along that same concept, only she is using spools of thread. So see if you can see the image. This lens, this sphere, is working very much like the lens of our eye works. So it will flip and rotate, and all of a sudden you see the face that is there in the dots of color. You can read about this. This is about after image, and you can also do this with the PowerPoint on your own. But when you have complementary colors working together, your eyes, because of the way that we perceive color, they will fatigue over a time, and you will start to see the reverse of what is there. That is called after image, and you start to see the complement of the colors. Make sure you also understand these terms with regard to the color wheel: monochromatic, using one color, lights and darks of it, but one color, and analogous, colors that are adjacent to each other on the color wheel. A very important component of color is emotion. So it is something that is cultural. Where we live often affects our perception of how colors make us feel, and it's also very personal. So something like this painting of the bridge, all of the blues tends to make us feel calm. Whereas this color, the yellows, are very warm, very energetic, and Franz Marc was exploring color and animals as stand-ins for the way that humans relate to one another. He painted this right around the time after he had just gotten married. So blue was very masculine, yellows and reds were more warm and feminine. Compare the bridge from Whistler with the bridge from Munch. So notice how he is using complementary colors, the reds against the greens. The blue is swirling and moving, strong diagonals that break up and take us through the composition. This is meant to have something that is energetic but also anguished. Understand the difference between texture and pattern. So an artist can suggest visual texture, like with this very naturalistic painting of the fruit, but an artist can also suggest visual texture by the way that they put in strokes of paint. That is different from pattern, which is more decorative and repetitive. So there's lots of patterns here with the sails. And space is something that is also important to understand. It is all in and around an object, extends in all directions. So space can be open or closed. Notice that, again, the positive areas of the sculpture are just as important as the negative spaces within the sculpture. Artists will try to imply space. So how do you suggest dimension in a work of art? If you put things higher up in a painting, they tend to feel further away. Or if you overlap objects, they tend to feel like they are going back in space. So this elephant feels like he's in the front, and this horse feels like he's in the back. Notice how this is a very non-Western work, whereas this is a Western work of art. Linear perspective during the Renaissance was key. So the linear perspective process uses a vanishing point. In this case, it is behind the head of Christ. And this work of art uses linear perspective to give us a feeling of space here at the Last Supper. And then atmospheric perspective has to do with the atmosphere. Light and shadow are affected by dust in the atmosphere, and this is captured in the painting.